Wall Street Wrap-Up is supported by Bamboolas, featuring live music and coming soon, tapas and wine upstairs. Bamboolas, the heartbeat of Frenchman Street.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, the Supreme Court hands down two big decisions. One, the inability to use race to determine eligibility for college admission. The other, striking down President Biden's student loan forgiveness. The Supreme Court saying only Congress can forgive the loans. And the 4th of July holiday starts today with AAA expecting a record travel holiday of over 50 million Americans hitting the roads, and also predicting 4 million of those will be at the airports. All this week, flights are delayed or have been canceled due to bad weather throughout the country. Adding to that, pilot and air traffic controller shortages. So this 4th of July, will many of those 4 million air travelers have to spend it at the airport? Tonight, we're going to be talking with the former CEO and chairman of United Airlines, Oscar Munoz, about summer travel demands, shortage of pilots and air traffic controllers. Oscar also wrote a new book about airlines, United Airlines, and his heart attack just 37 days into his tenure as CEO of the company. It's called Turnaround Time. Oscar Munoz will be with us tonight. I'm Andre Laborde. We've got these stories and more. It's Friday, and it's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, and welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. It's Friday, June the 30th. Well, on this last day of the month, and it's the end of the first half of 2023. In two major 6-3 decisions, the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in colleges that use race for determining as to admission in colleges. In a poll this week, it seems the public, almost in a 3 out of 4 poll, thought race should not be determining factor in college admission. Also, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court rejected the Biden administration's theory that they had the right to cancel student loans without congressional approval. Now, according to a Penn Wharton review, they found that by forgiving student loans, almost 70% would go to the top 60% of Americans by income. And the top 10% of individuals hold 17% of student loan debt and would be receiving forgiveness. Now, at present, the government holds almost $1.8 trillion in student loan debt on the books. Payments on student loans will be resuming in October after over 3 years. Originally, it was on hold due to COVID. Now, for every month the student loans were not paid, the Treasury lost about $5 billion per month. Well, how did our money do this week? Apple is the first stock ever to close above a $3 trillion market cap in the history of the stock market, and it occurred today. It was a strong week, quarter, and the first half of 2023. All stock indexes ended positive for the week, and the top sector for the first half of this year was technology, up 42%. With companies such as NVIDIA, Meta, and Tesla, they were scoring triple-digit gains in the first half of 2023. Well, this week, the Dow Jones closed today at 34,400, up 2% for the week. And the S&P 500, they closed today at 4450. That was up 2.3% for the week. And the NASDAQ, they closed today at 13,787, up 2.2% for the week. Well, Warren Buffett this week, well, he's on the move. He just purchased more shares in the oil company Occidental Petroleum. He now owns, through his Berkshire Hathaway, 25% of the company. Now we'll see if he decides on buying the other 75% eventually. This is the start of the 4th of July holiday, and because of weather, there's been massive flight delays and cancellations around the country. So what's in store for airline prices? And can airlines handle the air travelers with shortages of air traffic controllers, pilots, and other employees? Oscar Munoz, he's the former CEO of United Airlines, and he's also just written a new book about his time there called Turnaround Time, and he's back with us tonight. Hi, Oscar. Welcome back to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Hi, Andre. Nice to see you.
I was watching Scott Kirby maybe a couple of weeks ago. He was on one of the financial channels, and he was saying that this summer is going to be robust for the airline industry. I mean, people are getting off of COVID, and they're wanting to go travel and such. I'm curious your thoughts. Do you think the airline industry will be able to take such a high volume? And what I'm wondering about is pilot shortages, air traffic controllers, flights. I mean, will they be able to handle that type of a crowd?
Let's hope so. I think it'll differ between airlines for sure. I know that the volume expected at United specifically over this coming 4th of July holiday is about 5 million passengers, which is double digit, 12% increase year over year. So, interesting conversation that just a couple of years ago, we were wondering whether or not the volume would return, but yet here it is. And sure enough, it has returned in a robust way. Your specific question. So, air traffic controllers is something the airline doesn't control. And that's the interesting aspect of all of the flying patterns. The airlines certainly have a degree of responsibility for quite a few things, but not all of them. And so the trick, and it's across the industries, I've talked to everybody, I think they've all made their efforts to hire people. I know United has hired, they hired 15, 17,000 people last year. The pilot shortage, that's been looming for a long period of time. And I think the key in these times is to anticipate some of these risks that'll be coming up and put actions in place. And then air traffic control, boy, the state of Florida got hit hard a few months ago with just that very shortage. So, you try to stay very close with the federal government on these things, try to report those issues. But it's gonna be difficult at times in different patterns, different flight patterns. So let's keep our fingers crossed. It won't be for lack of trying from the airline. They clearly want to make sure they get you to the places that you want to be, but we are still having a little bit of malaise from the COVID days when we lost all those folks.
Was it because a lot of people took an early retirement and they decided now that they're retired, retirement that they don't want to come back? Or was it the same way as a shortage before March of 2020 as it is now?
No, I think COVID affected the economy writ large, right? In so many ways. I think people that have been part of a company, part of the family United for 25, 30 years, I think found it the right time and like to go, do something different. And it was a good time to retire. But it'd be interesting. I know I was there at United at the time. Heroic things from some of the more senior folks, knowing that at some point in time we would need less people for a short period of time rather than have one of their less tenured, lower ranking sort of employees that they worked with. They chose to retire to make sure that they made way for others who needed the role more. And so, it is very different than before. I think we're seeing it across all of industry, people not necessarily wanting to return for a host of different issues. And then the hybrid work models and other. So all of those things come into play. So it is very different than before COVID, and COVID has had it's kind of long COVID on the economy, if you will.
Yeah. Would you just recently, and I think it was last week, the House of Representatives, which also kind of surprised me. I didn't know this was because of a House bill, but the House passed a law to be able to raise the age of retirement for pilots from 65 to 67. Well, to be honest with you, I remember when it used to be 60. That you had to retire. But it's now from 65 to 67. But from what I understand, the Pilots Association is actually fighting that. Now, my first thought is they're part of the union members. I don't know, why is the Pilots Association fighting a retirement age raising from 65 to 67?
Andre, it's a wonderful question and probably a really good question for someone else. I think one of the things I'm learning as from my new vantage point, which is an effect on the sidelines, I respect and understand both of the viewpoints on either side of that equation, and it's a delicate one. So I think, given my vantage point, I'll stay away from that. I will say
Okay.
though,
Okay.
the process for becoming a first officer or moving to the left seat as a captain is an absolute rigorous one, and it should be. And if decisions have been made to change the age as they have before, I'm sure it's being done with all the thoughtfulness. And again, in a process of democracy, everyone will have their say in court, so to speak. And let's hope that we can reconcile that and move forward.
Do you think most people would be surprised to find out? I mean, before Before becoming CEO of United, you used to be the president and chief operating officer of CSX, a railroad company. And the margins at CSX is about a 20 to 30% net margin. Do you think people would be surprised to find out the net margins of a commercial airline? And I'll just stay with United because that's what you're more familiar with.
A couple things. One, the railroads' margins have increased mightily from even the days. I know that during my time there, we went roughly from 10% to probably close to 40% margins as we did a lot of activity to get more productive and grow revenue. The airline are probably a third, if not less, than the railroads. And so the industry still operates on very thin margins. And again, we're just coming out of COVID where we lost, 90+% of our revenue and maintain all the costs. So the profitability of an airline is significantly lower than what I used to be when I was part of the railroad.
Well, Oscar, let's say hypothetically, you walk into a United Airlines jet, and let's say you've got 100 people in the 100 passengers sitting in the fuselage. You've got fuel cost of, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, but let's say 29 of those 100, 29% are fuel cost. So that's wiped out right there. Then you got another 20%, let's say it's labor cost. And when I say labor, you're talking about not just labor, but retirement, and I would assume
wages and benefits,
costs?
right?
Wages and benefits.
Sure, benefits, right. Sure.
Now,
huge cost.
Your third cost, and as you would say, like an airline terminology, below the wing, I mean, you've got, what would be your third? Would it be your jet engine maintenance, or what would it be food and beverage? What's another cost of that?
Now, so labor and benefits and fuel are the two biggest costs by far. And then you have all the cost of operating. And then you have a significant cost that people don't often think about. It is what's called landing fees. So there's the cost per passenger that's required to land at all the different airports around the country. So you add all of that up together, you get close to, I think margins in the industry have ranged over time, but usually in the low teens has been considered a fairly decent margin. So there's a lot of cost that goes associated with that, but fuel and labor would be the two major ones.
Well, you're looking at right there, even at fuel and labor, if my percentages are right, of 29% fuel, 20% labor, give or take a little bit, you're almost at 50% right there. Well, the landing fees, would that be the same as, say, taxes and gate fees? Is that the same as?
It varies and it differs from place, but no, landing fees are a separate item, and they are the taxes and gate stuff is probably different than that. So that the combination, I mean, again, I'm trying to go back in my mind with the specific math, but specifically, I mean, it all adds up to fuel and labor are the two biggest components. Landing fees are probably third. Then you have all the cost of running things, and that takes close to 90% of or $900 out of that $1,000 that you mentioned earlier.
Let's say hypothetically, let's say you have a flight, and let's say New Orleans to Atlanta, and for just to let you know, I mean, that's less than a 1-hour flight. It's like 50 minutes, 55 minutes. In fact, it takes you longer to get to the airport and checking in than it does the actual flight. So you don't have maybe as much fuel cost, and you don't have food services, but you charge less. And then maybe let's say you have a 4 to 5 hour flight where now you have food and beverages and you have more fuel. Does an airline make more money on a short 50-minute flight, or do they make more money on a 4 to 5 hour flight? Because also what I'm thinking, Oscar, is that with your jet engines, for every hour you're running those engines, the maintenance, I don't know if it's an FAA rule or maybe United as well too, but if for every 100 hour, for every hour that those jet engines are running, you've got to do more maintenance. So that's taking away from the hours that you have to do more maintenance on it.
But that's a very technical question that we could spend a lot of time on, and a whole separate conversation on airline economics. And so, I'll start with the first the most important premise is using the right aircraft for the right for the right route. The short New Orleans to Atlanta flight, depending on how much capacity you can fill. So at the end of the day, on short haul flights, again, and then it's all dependent upon the demand for the limited supply. So a lot of times in these short hauls, when there's a lot of demand between two major traveling cities, that demand will generate a price increase that's higher than most, and you'll make, to some degree, more money on that shorter haul than you might on a longer one where there's not enough demand.
Take a route like I'm sure you're familiar with. Let's say Chicago O'Hare to Jacksonville, Florida. Okay, and I'm sure you've taken that route many a time before. And let's say, and I'm going to make this up. Let's say you have 6 flights a day. Okay, and if you have, say, a 60, let's say 70%, 60, 70% assigned seat miles, that you've got people in their seats, but maybe 20%, 30% is going empty. So if you take a flight out, okay, granted more people may be assigned in those seats, but would you also, so you'd make money that way, but would you also maybe lose on the area because many of these people maybe have connecting flights? So you're going to have a problem, say like the revenue of your assigned seat mileage. Is it more advantageous maybe to have more flights in those areas? Because I'll bet a lot of, as a commuter, I just see planes becoming more packed today.
So, well, again, these are great concepts and questions. I should write a book about this, actually.
You should. Let's call it turnaround time.
So, by and large, we run a hub and spoke network. The spokes are meant to feed the hubs to get to those longer haul flights. In a very simplistic sense, and this is not true, but generally, we will build enough spoke travel from, let's say, Jacksonville to Chicago to create and fulfill the demand for Chicago to further places away. Because a small city like Jacksonville doesn't fly all over the place. So if you want to fly to California, you fly from Jacksonville to Chicago to that. And depending on how those flows and demand we see the forecast, that's how many flights. You mentioned 6 flights from Jacksonville to, we would never have that many flights. There's just not enough volume to feed that particular hub to go somewhere else. So it's all dependent. So the people that do pricing and do network planning are some of the most sophisticated analytical folks that understand all the math behind this. And so every flight that's built is meant to feed a hub to go somewhere else, and it's priced accordingly. It's also meant to anticipate the demand we've had over the course of the last period of time. And so all of that is predicated, frankly, on existing demand on the limited supply. So, when what happened during COVID is probably a really good example. A lot of aircraft got grounded and parked, period. And then rather than bring all that aircraft back at once, the demand quite wasn't there. So what people would see, it's like, Oscar, I don't understand what the problem is. Every flight I've been on, it's been packed because we limited the amount of supply that came back in. So in your example of having 6 flights from JAX to ORD, we probably brought back 2 initially just to test the water, so we don't incur a lot of flights that are half empty and incurring all that expense. So it is an incredibly complicated choreography and dance that goes into the logistical planning of this, and that's where we have really good people that do that. So almost every flight you have, the trick is to have it as full as possible to maximize for not only our cost but also the revenue and demand and supply stream.
Well, you're talking about training, and I'm thinking about CEO training. And here's what I'm thinking today, unlike say years ago, today you've got more financial networks, and let's say things that happen at beyond your control, and let's say the political side of what's going on in the country. Things that happen, all of a sudden a financial, and I guess I'll call it ambush reporting, where reporters will call up, and I'm thinking offhand, I'm thinking of Ed Bastian with Delta, gets a call in Atlanta. What are you thinking about the Georgia voting law? Or Coca-Cola gets a call. What are you saying about that? What are you going to think? Now, all of a sudden, Bob Chapek, who used to be the boss at Disney, all of a sudden his employees are calling, and CNBC says, What are you saying about the Florida law or Chicago? I guess what I'm saying is that how do you maneuver? Look, you just want to sell airline tickets, okay? Or you want to sell anybody who wants to buy a ticket. But now you've got to walk a tightrope. Is there any kind of training for CEOs, whether you or Scott Kirby or others that sit in that C-suite? How do you do it?
There is no training. Often the best training you have is when you screw something up. And I think, as we
By
talk about
fire.
it, I think, right, in my book, I have, more than a few. I mean, I think, you learn more from the things that you fail at sometimes, and that's an important part of reality. So there's a part of that in training. But broadly is you should be anticipating the fact that indeed we live in a different day and age where questions like that can come from left field, whether they have any connection to you or your business. You're going to be asked in public. You should always have a thought about how you might want to answer that. Because the concept of no comment or silence is now deafening as well. And so, at least from my perspective, the way I've always approached it is you should opine and comment on things that affect your employee base, your consumers to some degree, because that's relevant. You shouldn't shoot from the hip on things that aren't part of you. The voting thing is probably something that was a good example of someone not quite thinking through what that question was. And then second of all, whatever you decide to do, have the logic and reasoning for why you commented the way you did. Because people may disagree, will disagree with you on all those matters. But if you can explain the reason why you made the decision you did, at least there's a concept behind it. I have many stories about that. Probably most notably the fact that we stopped a discount for the National Rifle Association after the Parkland shooting a few years ago, where the daughter of one of our pilots was killed. It was senseless. It was tragic. But I spent time with that family, and as we're leaving, everybody says you should do something about that, and guns, and the conversation around that is broad and complex. But at United, we had an ability to do something, even for the short term, to not offer those rates, and it was very impactful. I got a lot of very strong negative feedback that I was taking and my personal views and making it personal and making a decision. It wasn't personal, it wasn't philosophical, but it was somewhat personal, I said, because one of my family members, in essence, a daughter of one of our pilots, was tragically killed in that event. So it was the right thing to do. Now, whether you agree or not, or a lot of people agree, I have a reason why we in the corporation did something about that. And it wasn't a philosophical or political debate with me. It had to do with the circumstances of our employee base and what they needed at that time to heal.
Oscar, you have a unique perspective because as mentioned, before going into being CEO of United, you used to work at CSX as president. And just a couple of months ago, Norfolk Southern had a problem. Alan Shaw is the CEO at Norfolk Southern. And in East Palestine, Ohio, they had a train derailment. Well, I think every CEO thanks himself that, by the grace of God, I'm glad it wasn't me that is that problem. But if you were in a guiding area, how would you advise the CEO of somebody like Alan Shaw, who all of a sudden, through no fault of his own, but it happened, and you've got the media, you've got Congress, you've got people who are having their homes. How do you maneuver into a catastrophe, a crisis such as that?
Yeah, I actually spoke live on TV about that subject right after it happened and asked, in essence, the same question. And I'll repeat this. The trick to when you run an organization like that or like an airline, anticipating that at some point in time, despite everyone's best efforts and intents, something is going to go badly. And how you respond, when you respond, and the things that you do to make sure things don't happen are all part of the equation. And I think over time, what companies maybe forget that they're supposed to be prepared for this. So my advice wasn't advice, but just the practice that we deployed at CSX. And I had several of those when I was COO and when I was president, because things like that can happen.
Thank you, Oscar. You know, we had this interview earlier in the week. Now, we'll have part 2 of our interview with Oscar next week with a lot more great information. And we'll talk about the crises that he had and much more. Well, if you've got a question, maybe a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. Make it concise, make it pithy, and write us. And notice the new email address at andre@benecapital.com. So let's take a look at the markets heading into next week. And it'll be a shortened week because of the 4th of July holiday on Tuesday. But what communication product was released 16 years ago today in 2007 that would change the world? Well, we've got the answer, and it's coming up. Well, what communication product was released 16 years ago today in 2007 that would change the world? Apple's iPhone. In 2007, their first year, Apple brought in $123 million in revenue for the first iPhone. Now contrast that to last year. Apple last year brought in over $200 billion from iPhone sales, and that was just last year alone. So for this week, Apple is up over 3% for the last year, and for the last year, it's up over 41%. Now, just a thought, if you bought Apple stock on their IPO, their initial public offering in December of 1980, you would have a return of over 195,500%. No, that's not a typo. Over 195,000%. In fact, a $100 investment in Apple at their IPO in 1980 would be worth over $19.5 million today. Wow. Well said. Well said. And now let's have a wrap up on Wall Street. Want to buy a vowel? Ryan Seacrest is about to add Wheel of Fortune host to his resume. He's been named to replace Pat Sajak, who announced his retirement earlier this month after over 40 years on the job. Seacrest signed a multi-year contract to start hosting Wheel of Fortune in 24, and he will also serve as the consulting producer of the show. Now, Vanna White, she's negotiating to stay and is reported to be receiving $3 million a year for that, the same amount she's been receiving for the last 18 years. And that's a wrap-up on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Join us next week when we'll have our second part of our interview with Oscar Munoz. We'll talk about the crises he had while at United, and we'll even ask him, are our backsides getting larger, or are those airline seats actually getting smaller? We'll find out. Join me next week when we have our second part with Oscar Munoz, former CEO and chairman of United Airlines. Well, the markets are going to be closed next Tuesday, as I mentioned, for the 4th of July, and our thanks to Oscar for being a part of this evening. But always, we appreciate you for allowing us into your homes tonight. Have a fun weekend with the ones you love. Have a happy 4th of July, too. I'll see you next week. Remember, if it's Friday, it's Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde, and also remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Wall Street Wrap-Up is supported by Bamboolas, featuring live music and coming soon, tapas and wine upstairs. Bamboolas, the heartbeat of Frenchman Street.